أهلا وسهلا فيكم أعزائي المشاهدين. تنظم دار الآثار الإسلامية العديد من المحاضرات، منها في اللغة العربية ومنها في اللغة الإنجليزية. تابعونا، خلونا نستمتع معاكم في هذه المحاضرة المتميزة.
I would like to thank Sheikh Hussa and all the members of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya for the unfailing warm welcome I am offered every time I do come to the Dar, either as a resident scholar or as a lecturer like tonight, or just as a visitor. Thank you for the warmth and for your generosity and the passion that drives this collection and this evening. Our discussion tonight is the unpublished diary of a Lebanese Arab officer in the Ottoman army in the First World War. Last week, we had a screening of the classic film, Lawrence of Arabia, dealing with Arab-British relations in World War I. Tonight, we continue in the same theme, only from a different perspective. It's the war diary, as we mentioned, of Abd al-Majid, a Lebanese Arab officer from Beirut in the Ottoman army, and how he spent his war years. Who was Abd al-Majid, and what is the significance of this war diary? He was born in Beirut before the turn of the century, and he was the youngest of 7 siblings in a Lebanese Sunni Beiruti family. His family had moved from downtown Solidaire, where tonight the people are demonstrating, to the fairly empty area of Ras Beirut after the American University of Beirut, which was at that time called the Syrian Protestant College. And the area was empty. They moved over there in the hope that it would develop with the American University. Let's go back a few years before the World War I. The Ottoman Empire was, in the first years of the 20th century, they had wars against them in the Balkans in 1907, and let's get to the map. And then they had the attack of the Italians in 1912, so the army was not very well organized. The Minister of War, Enver Pasha, requested aid from the Germans to organize the Ottoman army. And it was organized along the German lines. All generals were retired, and the limits to conscription were removed. Non-Muslims who had not been allowed to enter the army were permitted. Eldest sons and those who were the only children were forced to go. Students which had not applied before were accepted, and so they had a much wider range of students and other members for the army. As for the significance of this unpublished diary, it's a detailed first-hand account of army life from the point of view of an educated Arab soldier in the Ottoman army, one of the very few written from this angle. Because during World War I, approximately 25,000 to 60,000 Ottomans were captured, and only half of them survived till the end of the war. Here you have a comical description of Europe in World War I, the Allies and the Axis, the Turks. We're going backwards and forwards. I'm not used to the machines, but you'll have to bear with me a little while. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire at the time. The story starts in July of 1915. Abd al-Majid had just terminated his second year of schooling in the Syrian Protestant College, which was later to become the American University of Beirut. As the Ottomans were increasing recruitment, they demanded that all students, all able-bodied men at the age of 20, to report to the army. As the Syrian Protestant College had a special relationship with the military governor Jamal Pasha, they were exceptionally permitted to go at the end of the school year. This special relationship between Jamal Pasha and the university started in a very funny way. The Pasha had a toothache, and his resident dentist couldn't help him. The university offered its services. The dentists from the university were good, and so the university got preferential treatment. And during the war, they served the wounded, and they also got special rations, flour, food, etc. So he went to the army in July of 1915. They had a choice, either to be recruited to volunteer and become officers, junior officers, serving 3 months in the Ottoman army training camps, and then being promoted with a salary of 4.5 Ottoman liras, which was quite a good sum for those days. And they would be promoted later on to positions of leadership eventually. Or else they could just not volunteer and wait till they were drafted, and then they would serve as infantry, as foot soldiers with no salary and no promotion. Of course, this offer sounded so nice that Abdul Majid and his friends decided to volunteer. The 1st of July, our hero goes to Damascus. Can we see where is the train? This is our hero, Abdul Majid, and this is his diary. This is a summary. So he decides to go to Damascus. They have 10 days to reach Damascus. And in those days, it was not as easy as now. Nowadays, you just get in a car, it takes you about 4 hours, and you're there. In those days, there was the steam engine, the train that was the first in the Ottoman Empire, and it went from Beirut up the mountains and to Damascus. But as it didn't run every day, they had to make their own arrangements, riding horses, walking some of the way. And he mentions in the diary, they left Beirut around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they reached the next day around sunset. So it tells you how the transportation was. They apply, they go to the interviews, they have many questions that they have to answer and so forth, and they are accepted. He says then later on, I wish we didn't go because it sounded so nice. What sounds so nice is usually not. They're signing up in the army, and they're looking forward to get their salaries, but still they have to make their way from Damascus to Constantinople to the military college. This is AUB. Here we have, this is Sofar Station in 1900s at the time they were going, and then Damascus at the time. So they go to Damascus and they register, then they have to walk all the way from Syria all the way to Constantinople. It's hot, it's the summertime, they don't have clothes, they don't have much food, there's not much cleanliness. He says they were full of lice, were put like cattle in the carts, and it's really not a very enjoyable experience, especially for these young men who were usually not used to this. They're basically just going to university, coming back home, they have clean houses, they have food, everything is ready, and now they have to face reality of life. They finally reached Constantinople, and they started the 3 months training in the school. This is the military academy where they were trained. He tells us about the 3 months of training. What do they experience? They get a little bit better food, but again, they have the week off. They go on Friday down to town, to Constantinople. He tells us how they used to get food from the shops to be able to satisfy their hunger. And as the camps, the school camps were not very clean, the best shower they could have was a natural one, standing in the rain under the eaves of the houses, getting a free shower and cleaner than what they had in the university. This takes us up to December of 1915. They have become officers, and they think that they are going to go and serve in the army. But it's not as simple as this. The army divides them into sections, into regiments, and all his friends are sent to Edirne, which is on the European side of the empire, to serve on the front against Romania and that area. He is sent alone from all his group to Gallipoli. Gallipoli, where the war was just a few months before, in March and April of 1915. It was the Battle of Gallipoli, the Australians and the English against the Ottomans, trying to break through, but that was one of the few Ottoman triumphs of the World War I. He tells us how he heard the gunshots and how they were sleeping in the open air in Gallipoli. This is around Christmas of 1915, 1916. And then, this is Anwar Pasha, the Minister of War, who had sent them back there. In December, the period of training on the front is over, and they get orders to come back to Constantinople, to the military academy, and they have 2 months of rest and recreation until their next expedition. He tells us how he spends his days in Constantinople in January, February, and March of 1916, going to see the museum. He saw the gardens. He went to Robert College, which was an American college in Constantinople, and a sister college of AUB, as SPC became later. And so he's spending sort of a better time than it was before. And we get in his readings now a bit more maturity, a bit more acceptance, and it's no longer the schoolboy who's miserable, who's crying with no food, etc. Now he's accepted the situation. In March, there is an order for the regiment to march back from Constantinople to Syria. They go back the way they came, and on the borders, the Syrian-Turkish borders, like today, it's a conflict zone. There, they don't know if they're going to be sent to Iraq or to Syria. Luckily for Abdelmajid, they are sent to Syria. In Syria, he is based at Zahle, which was part of the Syrian lands in those days before division, and he has, from March till July, posted there. He tells us now in his diaries, he had 2 chances to go home and to see his family who were in Beirut. The first time he went with permission. The second time he sneaked out, away without leave. He forged a pass from a doctor saying that he had to go. On the way back, he was caught. And so he was put into solitary confinement. While he was in the solitary confinement, the regiment was ordered to go and fight at the front. The front being on the border between Russia and Turkey, which is now the Caucasus and Armenia. They were sent again the way they came. They took the train to Aleppo. From Aleppo, they had to go walking to Diyarbakir. From Diyarbakir, they went to the front. But unfortunately for them, they had a guide from Diyarbakir who was supposed to lead them, but of course, he was just as bad as they were. He writes that we walked 6 times in one day in and out of the Euphrates River, going around in circles. They were ordered to deposit all their heavy artillery in Diyarbakir. They left the heavy guns, the tanks, and just took their handguns and walked to the front. Very bad decision. He reaches the front on the 30th of July, 1916. And it is the eve of Eid al-Fitr, 31st of July, 1916. There is the battle against the Russians, and the Ottomans are very quickly defeated. As he is the youngest of his troop, he decides to be the one to surrender, raising his handkerchief up and surrendering to the Russians. Part 2 now starts of the diary, his life in captivity. Here you have the Ottoman soldiers going to war in World War I. We have, this is the Caucasus campaign. It looks like they're skiing because it's the snow. So it's not a very good idea to go like this to war. 1914, the Ottomans were still fighting in the style of the 19th, 18th century with cavalry. And that is also another reason why they were defeated. Here you have the Russian army against whom they were fighting. And you can see the Russian soldiers on the front. So now he tells us about his life as a prisoner of war in the Russian war camps in almost 2 years, from August of 1916 till April of 1918. Upon surrender, the Russian officers interrogate the soldiers, the Turkish Ottoman soldiers, individually. As Abdelmajid is the youngest officer, he goes last. They usually go in, they're inquired, they ask them their names, their ranks, etc., and they go out. So the other soldiers were taking 10, 15 minutes each. Abdelmajid goes in, he speaks fluent English and French, and so he doesn't need a translator. The Russian officer is delighted to have somebody to speak French with. The Russian officers were usually from noble families from St. Petersburg, and they were educated in France, because the Russians would go to Saint-Cyr, and they would be educated there. So when he saw somebody speaking French, the poor officer was delighted to have somebody to talk to. He goes in, the usual questions, what are you, who are you, etc., and then they sit and chat. They sit for about 2 hours chatting. The officer offers him chocolates, he offers him cigarettes, he offers him food, and I think both sides were very happy. The local, our hero, because he got a meal, he tells us that it was the first time in 2 years that I eat decent food. And of course, the Russian officer, who had been used to St. Petersburg and the capital, thrown to the edges of the empire, is happy to have somebody of the same mental and language and environment as him. So he becomes friends with the officer, and they are sent in trains to go to the camp where the prisoners of war were kept, north of Moscow, in Kostroma. The diary tells us that as the train was going, just before Tbilisi, which is now Georgia, there were signs of typhus among the Turkish soldiers. The Russians decided to quarantine them in Tbilisi for a month, and we have a description of the first 2 weeks in Tbilisi of the hospitals. He compares it, the clean hospitals, we had good food, we had nurses taking care of us. I became friends with the doctor in charge and his wife because he had a medical background. And yet my other friends, the Arabs and the Turks, were not happy with this. They were complaining about the food, and they wanted to have their own food, take care of themselves. So the hospital assigned them a house in town. And he tells us, well, since my friends all went to this house, I couldn't leave them and go by myself. I had to go with them. And what a contrast. From the clean hospital with warm water and food and the nurses and everything, we had this little hovel in the middle of town with one window, hard floor, no heating. We had to get our own food. But this is what my friends wanted, and so I decided to go along. They finished the 2 weeks in quarantine, and they're permitted to go to town, always with a Russian officer accompanying them. They're sent then in the train, and they go north to Moscow, to Kostroma, the prisoners of war camp where they were kept. Arriving in Moscow in October, it's just barely the end of autumn, but they had 30 centimeters of snow. So imagine coming from Beirut, which was subtropical almost, to Constantinople, to Tbilisi, and then to the snow, and they're not dressed properly. He gives us a detailed account of the prisoner of war camp, and there are conflicts between the Arab and Turkish officers. The Arabs accuse the Turks of oppression, the Turks accuse the Arabs of treachery. To get away from all this, he goes with the other allies, with the Germans, the Austrians, and the Hungarians. There's lots of time in the prisoner of war camp, so he decides to learn languages. First, he learns Russian to be able to talk with his fellow officers, and then Russian, German with the officers who are with him, the Austrians and the Hungarians, and then Russian to talk to the directors of the camp. Here you can see winter in Siberia and winter on the road. This is the prisoner of war camp. This is not our hero, but somebody like him. Soon afterwards, the Swedish Red Cross visits the camps on missions of mercy, and they bring blankets, they bring warm clothes, and they give money to their proteges, the Austrians, the Hungarians, and the Germans. Now, nobody's looking at the Arabs or the Turks. So Abdul-Majid asks why, being the only one of the group who speaks the languages. It seems that since nobody can ask for anything because they don't speak the language, nobody's going to volunteer and help them. Even though he wasn't really friendly with his other officers, they asked him to help them, and he decided to be the spokesman. So he talked to the ladies of the Swedish Red Cross, and they got them warm blankets, they got them food, and they gave them salaries. In those days, in the days before World War I, fighting was more chivalrous than it is today. We had the Hague Convention of 1907, which defined the treatment of captured officers in time of war. The officers had to be treated as officers, the same quality and rank, as the officers capturing them. They were not to be given hard labor, they were to be accommodated, and they were to be given a salary equivalent to that of the officer in the country holding them. Officers in Russia at the time would get 50 rubles for a junior officer, 75 rubles for a captain, and 100 rubles for a general. So Abdul-Majid was quite happy because when he started in the Ottoman army, he was getting 4.5 Syrian or Ottoman pounds, which was the equivalent of about 30, 40 rubles. So now he got a promotion and not having to do anything, just to provide his food. So he enjoyed, more or less, his situation. Now we are getting close to the Russian Revolution in March of 1917. He tells us in detail how he saw the revolution coming. They were sitting in the camp and they saw students parading with flags and singing and shouting. So they thought perhaps it was one of the feast days, which he tells us the Russians had 42 or 43 feast days. So it might have been one of those. Or it might have been the wedding of one of the emperor's daughters. The emperor had 4 daughters, so it might have been one of those. When they asked, it seems no, it wasn't either. It was the revolution, they have gotten rid of the government, everyone's going to be equal, the soldiers have a chance now, the prisoners of war are invited to join the Bolshevik party and to become officers. Many of the Arab and Turkish officers decide to join. In this time as well, the British are visiting the camps. And they sit and talk with the Russian directors if any of the Arab officers would like to join the British army and go and fight with them in Palestine against the Turks. Several of the Arabs do accept, because at that time it was the British Prime Minister Lloyd George's idea and propaganda to be able to capture Jerusalem as fast as possible to bring up the morale of the troops. Well, the Arabs wanted to go, the Turks heard about it, again they started to fight, and so the director of the camp said, well, neither you nor you stay where you are, end of story. Another time they had also the British again, and they were thinking of trying to exchange some of the prisoners in the camp with prisoners, Russian prisoners in British camps. But again, because lots of fighting, people said yes, people said no, they didn't do anything about it. So they stayed in the camp, and now the Russian Revolution is running. You have Kerensky's government, and it's anarchy. Everybody is doing whatever they want for themselves. Food is running out, money is running out, and the Bolshevik officers are offering a chance with a promotion in rank for anybody who will join. Abdul-Majid joins, and do his friends. The easiest way for him to serve without being in the front line is to serve in the hospitals. So he tells us he went to the hospitals, he gets free food, he has warm surroundings, and he's taking care of something he knows. He spends this time until March of 1917 and until December in the hospitals, and then the Russians decide to move all the prisoners as far away from Moscow as possible. Order comes that they have to go, this is in March of 1918, when the snow is about this high, they have to go to Siberia. So they're taken on the train, the Trans-Siberian train, and they're sent from Moscow, where he had a sort of good job in the hospitals, to the unknown, to Siberia. In researching this project, I took the same trip, of course not as a prisoner of war, nor in the winter. It was in the summer, and it was a very pleasant trip. It took 4 days to cross 4,000 kilometers. In those days, it took 16. You can see this is the train crossing over the river Volga on the way to Siberia. They reached Siberia in March of 1918, beginning of spring for us, but there the snow was 2 meters high in some places. It was isolated, and it was so isolated that the Russians didn't even bother having the camp surrounded. The idea being that if anybody could survive and run and get away, good luck to them. The weather and the isolation was the guardian. When they reached the camp to Siberia, the prisoners of war were registered with camp authorities, and then they were given rather a wide margin of freedom. They could walk to the town, they could go to the mosque, because there was a mosque there on Fridays, and so they used the excuse of Friday going to the mosque to meet with the local Muslim inhabitants of the area and the Tatars. There was a Tatar community which they started to become friendly with, and so Abdul Majid and his companion, who was from Tripoli in Syria, and he was an engineer from the Imperial Engineer Corps in Constantinople, they had come together from the camp in Kostroma, near Moscow, all the way to Siberia, to Novo-Nikolaevsk, which became later, after the revolution, Novosibirsk. It's in the center of Siberia, and it's a junction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The city was created for the railway, and there was nothing else. So they go and become friends with the Tatars, and they start to plan the way of escaping. He says, if I didn't escape immediately, I'm going to freeze to death and be buried here. They start plotting their escape, and they're helped with their friends, the Tatars. They're given the names of friendly villagers and plans how to take the train, which places to stop in, where to ask, and of course they can go to the Swedish consulate once a month and collect their salaries, which has been promoted because they were promoted in the army. Now he's getting 100 rubles a month, which is a fortune. In those days, the normal salary for a good person working was about 30 rubles, of which he had to pay food, lodging, etc. So 100 rubles for somebody who didn't have to care of anything was very good in the time of war. With the help of forged passes, identifying them as civilian Turks, and giving them permission to search for work anywhere in Russia, because they said they couldn't find any jobs in Siberia, they made their way from Novo-Nikolaevsk to Omsk. You can see the map. And then from Omsk to Ufa. Ufa is closer to the west. On the way, on the train, they almost were caught by the Bolshevik soldiers. Abdul Majid and his buddy were talking in Arabic when 2 Bolshevik officers come and give them dirty looks. What are you doing? They ask them in Russian. They pretend not to speak. What are you speaking? Are you speaking Russian? He goes, Niet, no. Are you speaking Indian? They go, no. Are you speaking Arabic? They go, no. What are you speaking? So they tell them, Tatar. They invented it just to get them off their case. And they also got help from German agents who were on the train. Germans, being the allies of the Ottomans, were spread within Russia to try and help. The Russians, the white Russians against the red Russians, were also helping. The Tatars, the Caucasians, the Turkic-speaking people, all used to help them in the villages. From Ufa, they planned to go down to Samara, and then from Samara take a boat down the Volga, and then continue to Baku, and from Baku cross the Caspian. These are the Red Cross helping the soldiers. Cross the Caspian and down to Anzali on the coast of Iran near Qazwin, and then home. Well, they almost didn't make it. As they were in Astrakhan, we can see Astrakhan, which was on the banks of the Volga, they heard that in Baku, the Armenians were in control. And of course, the Armenians and the Turks weren't the best buddies. So they were warned not to go to Baku. They hid for a while, and they almost lost their courage, thinking, should they go back? Should they go north to Arkhangelsk and then to Sweden? Should they stay? What should they do? Finally, they gather up their courage, and they go to Baku, where they hide, first of all, in a Tatar mosque, and then they're given an address of the Tatars where they go. This time, their disguise is Persians. They have bought the Persian passports for a huge sum of 120 rubles, which is more than a month's salary for a general, and they disguise themselves as Persian traders from Erdebil to explain their Turkish accent, because Erdebil was on the Turkish-Persian border, and that they were going to the Holy Lands on pilgrimage. Now, the trick is to get a ticket on the boat and cross. Abdul-Majid doesn't speak Persian, but his friend does. So they pretended that Abdul-Majid was sick, he stayed at home, and his friend went to buy tickets from the ticket master. A new rule had come up, which he tells us, that everyone has to identify himself before leaving Russia. His friend tries to say that my friend is sick, he has a contagious disease, I don't advise you to look at him because it's not very good, but the ticket master says no. I insist, you have to, otherwise you no go. They start shouting, and he's almost sent home until the conductor's daughter, who was at school, comes and she sees her father. She asks him, Daddy, what's wrong? What's happening? They tell him the story, and says, please, Daddy, help the poor man. And so by luck, they give them the pass, and they are able to escape. Both of them escape. They get on the boat. It takes them 24 hours from Baku to the other side of the Caspian, and hopefully they're safe. But no. Next day, the Cossack officers see them and arrest them because they're dressed in Russian clothes. What are you doing? Where are you going? They're arrested, and they're going to be put in camp, in a prison. Luckily for them, again, there are British officers seeing them. So they shout in English, please help us, and the officers are intrigued to see these Russian, scruffy-looking men speaking perfect English. When they ask them, where did you come from, what are you doing, they tell them the story, and the British officers help them and take them to Baghdad. In Baghdad, they're offered the job of working with the British High Command. Now we are in August of 1918. The war is almost over. The British are taking over Baghdad, and both of them are offered positions in the British Army. Abdul-Majid decides to work in the hospital, the military hospital, and he's an instructor of English with the High Command. Among his students, this is the Tatars who helped them escape. You can see the Tatars in the day. Here they're entering Baghdad in the 1918. This is the hospital ship. and so he works in the military hospital. Among his students are Thomas Carey Evans, who was the son-in-law of the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. And they become very good friends. The war is over, and he's given permission to go home. As a favor, they ask him, would you like to go by land or by sea? Ever the curious person, Abdul Majid says, no, I'd love to go by sea, to see new lands. They sent him down the river on a river ship to Basra, and then from Basra, they take this ship, the Baroda, to Bombay. He spends a week in Bombay, and amazingly, he tells us he's impressed with the cleanliness of Bombay, with the wide streets of Bombay, but he's disappointed with the British treatment of the locals in India. This is Bombay in the days when you didn't have millions of people in it. From Bombay, they take another British Army ship to Aden. And from Aden, they go up the Red Sea to Suez Canal. They cross to Ismailiyah. From Ismailiyah, they take another boat, and then they are home to Lebanon. This is now almost exactly 4 years after he started. Safe and sound, he is back home. He goes back to the university, completes a degree in the university. In 1924, he graduates, gets married and has a family, and then goes into the family business. Now, the significance of this diary is, first of all, as we said, a story from the other side. Usually, history is written by the victors. And so we have lots of stories from the English, from the French, from the Russians, but very few from the Ottomans. And as the Arabs were not really integrated into the Ottoman army, it's unusual to get this. We do have a very positive attitude our hero has. He tells us about the misery he suffered in his own army, the Ottoman army. No clothes, no weapons, no food. And then when he went to the enemy, he got better treatment, more respect. The army was better equipped. He was lucky to be able to serve in the hospitals and survived. We hope to publish the diary soon, and I would be delighted if sometime next year or thereafter we can have a book signing here and introduce you to the story itself. I think we are ready.
وفي الختام مشاهدينا الكرام، ما يسعني إلا أن أشكركم لحسن المتابعة، وأتمنى كل ما قدم قد حاز على إعجابكم. تقبلوا تحيات فريق العمل، على أمل أن نلتقي معكم في محاضرة أخرى إن شاء الله. في أمان الله.